September 1940. Warsaw. The city is gray, broken, and breathing fear. Boots echo on cobblestones. German soldiers herd civilians into the street, families clutching what they can carry, papers trembling in their hands. A man stands in the crowd, calm amid the panic. His name is Witold Pilecki, but the name he carries today is false, Tomasz Serafiński. He adjusts his coat, steps forward, and blends in with the terrified. To the guards, he's just another prisoner. But he's not trying to escape. He's trying to get in. Trucks rumble as the roundup begins. The prisoners are pushed inside, metal slamming behind them. The air smells of exhaust and cold iron. Someone cries out for a child. Another whispers a prayer. Pilecki stays silent. Beneath his shirt, he hides a folded note, his true identity and his mission. As the truck lurches forward, he looks through the slats at the dying city behind him. He knows where they're going. Rumors call it Auschwitz. No one comes back from there. He presses his hand to his chest and thinks, they can kill my body, not my witness. And with that single thought, Witold Pilecki becomes the only man in history who chose to enter Auschwitz. He had every reason not to go. By 1940, Witold Pilecki was a man who had already lived several lives. A decorated Polish cavalry officer, a husband, a father of two, and a believer in faith and duty above fear. He had survived the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 as a young volunteer, riding horseback through mud and fire to defend a fragile new republic. Now, 2 decades later, his country was gone again, split in half by Hitler and Stalin, erased from the map he had once fought to protect. When the Germans invaded in September 1939, Pilecki didn't surrender. Instead, he helped form one of Europe's first underground resistance groups, the Tajna Armia Polska, the secret Polish army. It was an improvised brotherhood. Teachers, priests, railway workers, and farmers armed with little more than stolen pistols and faith. They printed newspapers, passed coded messages, and dreamed of a free Poland beneath the boot of tyranny. Then, in the spring of 1940, whispers began to spread through occupied Warsaw, whispers of a new camp being built near the small town of Auschwitz. The Germans called it Auschwitz. They said it was a labor camp. But trainloads of men went in, and none came out. Pilecki's intelligence officers were desperate to know the truth. How many prisoners? What kind of work? Was it punishment, or something worse? To find out, someone would have to go inside. The room fell silent when the question was asked, who will volunteer to enter Auschwitz? There were no hands. How could there be? It was a death sentence disguised as a mission. Then quietly Pilecki stepped forward. No hesitation. No discussion. Just the calm voice of a man who had already decided. His commanders were stunned. They told him, you don't understand. You won't come back. But he did understand. That was the point. He forged new identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński, taking the identity of a real Polish civilian already presumed dead. His new persona erased his rank, his title, his life. He would enter as an ordinary prisoner, without protection, without escape, and without a guarantee that the world would ever even know his name. Before leaving, he returned home one last time. His wife, Maria, noticed he seemed distant. He kissed her cheek, held her hands, and spoke softly so the children wouldn't hear. He didn't say where he was going. Only that it was for Poland, and that if he didn't return she should be proud, not sad. Then, on September 19, 1940, during a mass German roundup on the streets of Warsaw, Pilecki deliberately walked into the chaos. Gestapo officers shouted, trucks filled with prisoners, and people screamed as they were forced into lines. Pilecki, wearing plain clothes, stepped into the crowd, his forged papers tucked in his coat, his real ones destroyed. When the soldiers demanded his documents, he handed them over calmly as if caught by chance. Within hours he was beaten, shackled, and loaded into a transport bound for a destination few ever returned from. As the truck rumbled through the city, he looked back at Warsaw, the skyline fading into smoke and ruin. He didn't know if he'd ever see it again. Before leaving, he had told his comrades in the underground, I will report from the place where humanity ends. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't martyrdom. It was duty, cold, deliberate, and absolute. Because for Witold Pilecki, courage wasn't about surviving. It was about witnessing no matter the cost. And that's how, under the alias Tomasz Serafiński, prisoner number 4859 began his journey into Auschwitz, by choice. The truck stopped at dawn. Mist hung low over the fields and the smell hit before the sound, smoke and something burning. Men were shouting in German, dogs barking, boots hammering on frozen mud. The prisoners were dragged out, one by one, stripped of whatever still made them human. Ahead stood the gate. Iron letters curved above it, black against the pale sky. Arbeit macht free. Work sets you free. The lie every prisoner would learn by heart. Witold Pilecki didn't look away. He memorized everything, the guards, the layout, the towers, the rhythms of cruelty. Every observation was a message he planned to send out. Even in shock, he was already thinking like an intelligence officer. They shaved his head, took his clothes, beat him for answering too slowly. When they asked his name, he gave the false one, Tomasz Serafiński. They stamped a number on his arm, 4859, the identity that would replace his face. Inside the barracks, he saw men crammed into bunks 3 high, half alive, coughing into the cold. Someone whispered, "Don't speak. They kill for that." Pilecki nodded but took mental notes. The smell of carbolic acid, the sound of a train unloading, the guard rotations. In a place built to erase identity, he began quietly building a record of it. Each scream, each shadow, each face etched into memory. Later he would write, every scream became a coordinate. And from that first night, Witold Pilecki, prisoner 4859, started his real mission, to make sure the world could never say it didn't know. Inside Auschwitz, life was measured in minutes, and often even that was generous. A guard's mood, a random selection, a broken machine, any could decide whether a prisoner lived or died before the next sunrise. Every breath was borrowed, every heartbeat stolen from a schedule of death. But while others tried only to survive the next minute, Witold Pilecki began counting men. He watched, listened, memorized faces, priests still whispering prayers, teachers reciting lessons in their sleep, doctors bandaging wounds with scraps of cloth, tradesmen improvising tools to survive another day. He looked for the ones who still thought, who still cared, who still believed. Slowly, cautiously, he began to speak to them, not with open words but with glances, coded nods, and murmured phrases timed perfectly beneath the sound of guards' boots. To talk in Auschwitz was a death sentence. But silence, Pilecki believed, was worse. He began to form a chain of trust, one link at a time. At roll call, a flick of a finger meant safe. A look toward the sky meant wait. A hand brushed across the chest meant brother. Through these tiny, invisible signals, the impossible began to take shape, an army within the camp. By the end of his second month, Pilecki had built a network of over 100 prisoners, each sworn to secrecy under pain of death. They called themselves Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, the Union of Military Organization. It was the first organized resistance cell inside any Nazi concentration camp, a rebellion born not from weapons but from will. Their mission was as desperate as it was noble. Smuggle information out to the Polish resistance. Keep hope alive among the dying. Prepare for a revolt that might never come. To outsiders they were skeletons in striped rags. But beneath that disguise they became spies, couriers, and soldiers once more. Pilecki's system was meticulous, almost military. He divided the camp into sections, each led by trusted men. One group handled intelligence, memorizing train schedules, counting transports, tracking new arrivals and disappearances. Another handled logistics, stealing medicine, redistributing food, arranging hiding places for escape attempts. Still others forged connections with sympathetic civilian workers who entered the camp, Poles forced by the Germans to perform maintenance and supply duties. Every night, when the guards' voices faded, Pilecki would take scraps of paper, torn from cement bags, stolen from office trash, and write by candle stub. Numbers, dates, names. Every fragment was evidence, proof that Auschwitz was not a labor camp but a machine of murder. The reports were smuggled out through a web of bribed workers and risked civilians. Some were sewn into clothing destined for German factories. Others were hidden in the seams of laundry, carried by the same trucks that brought in supplies. Still others were memorized, word for word, by prisoners selected for transfer to other camps, hoping one of them might live long enough to deliver the message. Pilecki even began drafting plans for an uprising. If Allied forces ever came close enough, the underground would seize weapons from the SS guards, open the gates, and free the camp by force. It was a dream most called suicide, but Pilecki didn't care. In a place where death was routine, daring to plan for freedom was itself an act of defiance. When fellow prisoners were sent to the gas chambers, Pilecki wrote down their names from memory, refusing to let them vanish as numbers. When someone escaped, he analyzed every detail, the timing, the patrol patterns, the weak points in the fence, testing what could be repeated. Every scrap of note, every coded message, was a small victory against annihilation. He was turning Auschwitz's own precision against itself, turning record-keeping into rebellion. The SS, arrogant in their cruelty, never imagined that within their own walls a Polish military cell was forming, an army with no rifles, no bullets, no uniforms. Just faith, discipline, and the will to bear witness. Pilecki later wrote in his report, "The camp was not built for escape, but neither was it built to contain the spirit of men." That was the truth he forged behind the wire, a truth that no wall, no gun, no guard tower could silence. And so, in the darkest place on earth, Witold Pilecki built the light. By late 1941, Auschwitz had evolved from a prison into a machine, one fueled by terror, precision, and routine. Every sunrise brought the same rhythm. Boots on gravel, whistles, screams, the smell of burnt flesh drifting across the camp. And in the middle of that nightmare, Witold Pilecki was writing, not to survive but to make sure the world would one day know. His first messages were brief, cautious. Written on scraps of paper barely larger than a matchbox. He bribed Polish civilian workers who entered the camp with food deliveries, laundry carts, or building materials. They would carry the notes out, tucked into seams, folded into boots, sometimes even hidden in loaves of bread. When that became too dangerous, Pilecki turned to microfilm. Using stolen chemicals and bits of photographic film, his network copied reports so small they could fit inside a button. The pages described execution quotas, transport numbers, disease outbreaks, and the first experimental gassings in horrifying, methodical detail. "There is no labor camp here," one line read. "There is only a place built for death." He knew every courier might die carrying his message. Some did, intercepted, tortured, vanished. But enough reached Warsaw to create what became known as Witold's reports. These reports described starvation so desperate that men fought rats for scraps. They spoke of prisoners collapsing from exhaustion, only to be shot for slowing the line. Of guards who treated execution as sport, betting cigarettes on how many prisoners they could kill before roll call ended. When gas chambers began operating, Pilecki's tone shifted from disbelief to fury. He recorded the deception, the showers, the medical inspections, before the screams began. He described chimneys that burned day and night, the sky blackened with ash, the air thick with the smell of charred bodies. But he could not use plain language. Every message was encoded. New hospital built, a gas chamber. High mortality among patients, mass executions. Increased productivity, more killings per day. Each report ended the same way. "We need help." Even a single bomb could stop the transports. The Polish underground risked everything to pass his words to London through resistance couriers. And yet, the Allies refused to believe. British intelligence marked his reports as unverified. American analysts called them exaggerations. No one could imagine that human beings had industrialized murder. So Pilecki kept going. He and his men built a secret radio transmitter using stolen parts from German workshops. 4 months, they tried to broadcast Morse code through the camp's power lines, a heartbeat from hell reaching toward the free world. The signal was weak, often jammed, but it worked, briefly. His coded broadcasts confirmed, beyond doubt, that Auschwitz was not a prison. It was an extermination site. By 1942, disease had nearly killed him. His body was covered in sores. Typhus raged through the barracks, and yet he refused the infirmary. He wrote by candle stubs, feverish and shaking, his words smuggled out one by one. "If I die," he whispered once to a comrade, "the world must not say later that it did not know." For nearly 3 years, Pilecki fought his war without a weapon, armed only with paper, courage, and the conviction that truth itself could wound a tyrant. By the spring of 1943, after nearly 3 years inside Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki was no longer just a prisoner. He had become the heartbeat of a secret army buried under ashes. But his body was giving up. His ribs showed through his striped uniform, his skin was gray with fever, and his legs trembled when he stood. Still, his eyes burned with one last mission, to escape and prove to the world that Auschwitz was real. His reports had been smuggled out again and again, coded, desperate, specific. And yet, the Allies had done nothing. They doubted the scale of the horror. They wanted confirmation. Pilecki decided. He would bring them the truth himself. He began to plan the unthinkable, an escape from the most secure death camp in the world. The opportunity came through the bakery detail, a work assignment near the outer perimeter of the camp. Only a few prisoners were trusted there, baking bread for the German garrison. At night, they could hear the faint hum of the electric fences, see the guard towers in the distance. That was where Pilecki and his 2 most loyal comrades, Edward Szyszewski and Jan Redzig, began to whisper their plan. They studied the rhythm of the guards, who smoked, who drank, who was bored enough to look away. They memorized every patrol change, every blind spot between the light posts. For weeks they stole fragments of tools, bits of wire, and even a small file. Each piece smuggled past random searches, hidden under rags or inside bread loaves. Pilecki also knew what he had to carry: a microfilm report, the sum of everything he'd witnessed. Numbers of transports. Blueprints of gas chambers. Names of guards. Eyewitness accounts. It was not just paper. It was evidence. If he failed, it would burn with him. On April 26, 1943, it began. The camp was quiet under a misty night. Rain had turned the ground to mud, muffling footsteps. Inside the bakery, Pilecki and his men pretended to work as usual until the last German guard left his post to fetch water. Then silence. They moved fast. Szyszewski pried loose the back hinges of the bakery door. Redzig cut the outer padlock with the stolen file, working by feel. The electric fence still loomed ahead, humming faintly like an iron heartbeat. They crawled through a drainage ditch slick with slime, its stench choking them, and waited for the guard's flashlight to pass. A flash of lightning split the sky. They froze, faces in the mud, motionless. The guard turned, paused, then moved on. When the light faded, Pilecki whispered one word: "Run." They slipped through a section of the fence that had been disabled by resistance workers days before, a small miracle of timing and luck. Beyond it lay open countryside, dark and endless. They ran barefoot through fields, over streams, through rain that felt like needles on their skin. They had no map, no food, just direction: west. For 3 days they hid in barns and forests, moving only at night. They drank from puddles, scavenged from fields, and prayed the barking dogs they heard belonged to farmers, not patrols. By the time they reached a Polish resistance contact in the village of WWII, their feet were bleeding and their clothes hung in tatters. But the film, the proof, was intact. Pilecki's report reached Warsaw first, then London. It described the camp's organization, extermination systems, and the number of Jews and Poles being murdered daily. He begged the Allies to bomb the train lines to Auschwitz or the crematoria themselves. But again the answer came back: unverified. Not actionable. Still, Pilecki had done the impossible. He had infiltrated the gates of hell, built an army inside it, and walked back out alive to tell the world. He wrote in his debriefing, "I escaped not for myself but for those who could not." And yet he was not done. As soon as his wounds healed, Witold Pilecki picked up a pistol, rejoined the Polish resistance, and went back to war, not against the Germans this time, but against another kind of tyranny that would soon rise over his homeland. When Witold Pilecki returned to Warsaw after escaping Auschwitz, he didn't rest. He could have fled west, hidden, or disappeared like so many other resistance members. Instead, he went straight back into the fight. Poland was still bleeding, first under German occupation, then under the creeping shadow of Soviet control. In the months after his escape, he compiled every page of his notes into a full report, later known as Witold's Report. It contained names, dates, blueprints, and first-hand witness accounts of the atrocities in Auschwitz. He described the gas chambers, the crematoria, the systematic annihilation of Jews, Poles, and prisoners of war. It was one of the first verified, detailed intelligence documents on the Holocaust ever sent to the Western Allies. But London and Washington were exhausted by war. Their focus had shifted to military victory, not humanitarian intervention. His pleas to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz, or the crematoria themselves, went unanswered. "The world will not believe until the war is over," one Polish diplomat told him quietly. It broke something inside him, but not his will. In August 1944, when Warsaw rose against the Nazis in the desperate Warsaw Uprising, Pilecki joined immediately. He fought under the codename Roman Yazierski. Wounded twice, he led platoons through rubble-strewn streets, guiding civilians to safety, helping organize food and ammunition runs through sewers. When the uprising collapsed, he was captured again, this time sent to Stalag 7A, a German POW camp in Bavaria. He survived until liberation in 1945. Freedom, however, was not the end of his war. When Pilecki returned to Poland, it was no longer his homeland, at least not the one he had fought for. The Soviets had replaced one tyranny with another. The newly installed communist regime began rounding up members of the Home Army, the very people who had resisted the Nazis. To them, patriots like Pilecki were enemies of the state. Still, he volunteered again, this time for an even more dangerous mission. He infiltrated the communist-controlled government in Warsaw as an undercover operative, gathering intelligence on the arrests, disappearances, and executions of former resistance members. He reported directly to Polish leaders in exile and Western intelligence agencies. For nearly 2 years he risked his life once more, this time not for Poland's liberation from foreign rule, but from its own rulers. Then in May 1947 his luck ended. He was betrayed by an informant, arrested by the communist secret police UB, and dragged into a windowless cell in Warsaw's Mokotów prison. There, the same man who had faced Nazis in Auschwitz was beaten, starved, and tortured by his own countrymen. His ribs were broken again. His fingernails torn out. His spine cracked under interrogations that lasted days. But like before, he said nothing, not about his contacts, not about his missions, not about the network that still resisted. When his captors demanded he confess to spying for foreign powers, he smiled faintly and said, "I have tried to live so that I could look my countrymen in the eye." His trial, if it could be called that, lasted only a few hours. He was sentenced to death for treason. The verdict was predetermined. On May 25, 1948, in the basement of Mokotów prison, Witold Pilecki was executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. His body was dumped into an unmarked grave, somewhere beneath the grass of Warsaw's Puławski Cemetery, still unknown today. For decades his name was erased from history. His reports censored. His family silenced. It wasn't until the fall of communism in 1989 that his story resurfaced. One document at a time, one testimony after another. Today, Witold Pilecki is remembered as one of the bravest men in human history, the only man to voluntarily enter Auschwitz and live to tell the world what he saw. In 2006, he was posthumously awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest honor. He once wrote, "I tried to live my life so that in the hour of my death I would feel joy, not fear." And in that final hour, though buried in silence, his witness still spoke, louder than ever. Because Pilecki did not die for recognition or medals. He died for truth, the kind that cannot be killed, buried, or denied. For nearly half a century, Witold Pilecki's story was buried deeper than his body. The Polish communist regime erased his name from textbooks, sealed his files, and punished anyone who dared speak it aloud. To generations of schoolchildren, he simply didn't exist. The man who had once risked everything to expose Auschwitz was now a ghost, not by accident but by design. But history has a way of whispering through silence. In the late 1980s, as cracks began to appear in the Iron Curtain, a few surviving members of the Polish resistance began to talk. They remembered a quiet officer with piercing eyes, a man who had volunteered to walk into the heart of death for a cause greater than himself. They spoke his name again, Witold Pilecki. When communist censorship finally collapsed in 1989, dusty files emerged from secret archives. Interrogation transcripts, coded reports, fragments of smuggled microfilm. Among them were the pages of Rapport Witolda, Witold's report, the original intelligence documents he had risked his life to deliver to the Allies in 1942 and 1943. Each page bore the marks of a man writing against time. Smudged ink, cramped handwriting, urgent brevity. Historians were stunned. For decades, the Western world had assumed that Auschwitz's horrors were only discovered after liberation in 1945. Now they realized, one man had warned them 3 years earlier. The crematoria glow at night. The smell carries for miles, Pilecki had written. They are murdering thousands every day. Please do not wait. It was no longer a rumor. It was undeniable evidence. And it came from a man who had gone in willingly. In 2000, the Polish government officially honored him as a hero of the nation. His story spread across Europe, in classrooms, military academies, and memorials. The phrase, "the man who volunteered for Auschwitz," began appearing in history documentaries and war archives. In 2006, he was posthumously awarded Poland's Order of the White Eagle, the highest decoration for courage and service. In 2013, a bronze statue of him was unveiled in Warsaw, his gaze fixed toward the West, toward the free world he had once pleaded with to act. Even so, when people read his words today, it's the quiet moments that strike hardest. Not the escape, not the torture, not the war. But the simplicity of his faith, that truth was worth dying for. He never sought vengeance. He never spoke in hate. He simply wanted the world to know, so that it could never happen again. "We must not become the monsters we fight," he once wrote. "If I forget that, then all of this was for nothing." His children, raised under communist rule, grew up thinking their father was a traitor, until his name was cleared decades later. Imagine that, a hero to the world, but a criminal in the eyes of his own nation, until truth finally caught up with politics. Today, the story of Witold Pilecki is taught not just as history, but as a moral compass. Military officers study his courage under captivity. Human rights organizations quote his reports as early documentation of genocide. His words are engraved at museums in Poland, Israel, and the United States. In 2012, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum recognized him as one of the first credible witnesses to the Holocaust. Historians now call him the man who told the world the truth and was ignored. His final act, refusing to betray his comrades even under torture, has become a symbol of absolute integrity. To this day, no one knows exactly where his remains lie. Perhaps that is fitting. Because Witold Pilecki belongs not to one grave, but to every place where truth still fights to be heard. He was not a soldier chasing glory, nor a martyr seeking death. He was a witness, one man who looked into hell and refused to look away. If there is a lesson in his life, it's this: courage is not the absence of fear. It's walking into the fire when everyone else turns away. This is Shadows of Valor, where history's silence finds its voice. If you believe stories like Pilecki's deserve to be remembered, help us keep them alive. Subscribe, share, and stand with the voices that refuse to be silenced.